Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Great. Well, welcome to this session, Infrastructure. When you think of India, there are probably many things that come to someone's mind. There's obviously cricket, and just to keep you in the loop, we've got a South African on the panel. There's the India-South Africa test match going on. There's Bollywood movies. And of course, there's infrastructure, because anyone who travels in and out of the country, anyone who lives there, it's like India and infrastructure, two sides of the coin. And I think that's the reason why so many of you are here. And it's my honor to chair such a distinguished panel. I have to make one correction. Mr. Parthasarathy is not here. He's actually replaced by Mr. Hari Shankaran, who's the Deputy Chairman and Managing Director of the same company. So we are very well represented. I'll just start a little bit about our panel members, just to give you an idea as to what range of expertise we have on stage. We have, of course, Manohar Kyatani, who is CEO of Ascendus Singbridge. And Manohar has had a distinguished career. He was at the EDB, and then he ran GTC, which is the large asset-owning company in Singapore, government of Singapore backed. Did a lot of the industrial properties in Jurong, but much more than Jurong. Then after joining Ascendus, he has been one of the most successful companies operating in India and elsewhere, running large business parks, doing deals, both managing and operating companies. So it'll be great to hear his experience on the ground. Then we, of course, have Hari Shankaran, who runs ILFS, together with Mr. Parthasarathy, big leasing finance company. Really interesting to get his insights as to what is happening on the ground, some of the legislative changes, some of the regulatory changes. These are some of the things which have been obstacles in the past. And the new government, Mr. Modi's government, really keen to get India moving, manufacturing in India. Manufacturing in India, you need infrastructure. Without that, how do you do supply chains? And I think we've got some good news that Hari will be sharing with us, so we'll be listening to him. And then, of course, Ang Eng Seng from GIC, Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, a big financial investor globally. India is one of the countries that GIC is looking at increasing perhaps its investment allocation. And he will also share his experiences as a financial investor. What is it that they are looking for? Because ultimately, when you want to develop infrastructure, financing and getting financial investors is a very key consideration. So it'll be very interesting to hear his perspectives. And then we have from PSA, we have Wan Chi Fung, and I was really impressed at what PSA and Chi Fung has been doing in India, in different parts of India, developing ports and terminals. So his experience on the ground will also be very interesting. And then Mark Rathbone, a former colleague of mine in PricewaterhouseCoopers, he runs the public-private partnership in the whole infrastructure space. And he's done it internationally in London, and now all over in Asia Pacific, in India, in many ASEAN and South Asia countries. So that's our panel. And before I ask Manohar to say a few things about his experience on the ground, I would like to say from my own perspectives, as with 30 years in Pricewaterhouse, for a period I ran Pricewaterhouse India. And now, the last 5 years with Blackstone, was one of the major investors in India. Blackstone's invested over $2 billion in India in the real estate space and in private equity space. We see India as one of our most attractive markets. And we see that because some of the whole sort of the macro, as well as some of the opportunities on the ground are better than most other places. India is a young country. The demographics are right. It's on a path. If you look at what is achieved the last several years, growth of 6-7%, a lot of desire, by the government to make things easier for business people. And in some ways, India is very first world. I mean, Blackstone, of course, is a very New York-centric company, but if you go into Mumbai and you're in southern Mumbai and you're staying at the Oberoi and our office is at Express Towers. I mean, that's very first world in terms of really operating environment. You have great skills on the ground, great legal help, great financial help, a very talented workforce. Our India team, the team that's invested $2 billion in the ground is all Indian. Everybody in the team is Indian. They are, typically IIT graduates who've then gone on to business school either in India or in the US. And this quality of talent has helped us grow our India franchise. And that's the way we like to do it. Of course, there are challenges, and that's some of the things that we will be discussing. What are the challenges? How can we make it better? How can we get a better bang for the buck? Because when you invest, as many of these distinguished panelists will tell you, they have a choice. They're not only investing in India. They have got a choice to invest in other countries, in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in South America. So, competitiveness is very important. And India, even though it's sort of reached, it's moved up a little bit in the competitive index. I believe moving up from 120 to 100 is progress, but you really need to be in the top 20 or 30, to really make an impact in terms of just getting things done, not being bogged down by unnecessary red tape, unnecessary delays. So these are some of the areas that we need to work on. And I think we've got a government that's willing to listen. I think they are willing to engage with business. And so let's hear from our panelists what their experience is and what can be done better. So I'll start with Manohar. Manohar, maybe it's a little bit about what you're doing with Ascendus.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gautam. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for taking your valuable time to spend your weekend with us. Ascendus Singbridge, the company that I represent, we are a developer of urban solutions spanning townships, mixed developments, business space. We are Singapore headquartered. We are a quintessential Singapore MNC. Our major shareholders are Temasek, the biggest investment company in Singapore, and JTC Corporation. We have assets under management of about just over 20 billion Singapore dollars, about 15 billion US dollars. We are in 29 cities, 10 countries in Asia and Australia. We have been in India for about 23 years. Our entry into India was initiated through a G2G initiative to develop an industrial park somewhere in India. What started off as an industrial park became then a business IT park. So we went to Whitefield, we partnered the Tata Group, and we took a space that was not the most attractive, I would say, but getting land in India is not easy. And we initiated the concept of an IT park in India. Of course, now you see IT parks everywhere, but the origin of the IT park actually started in Whitefield. It was a project with many challenges. I was not there, thank God, so I still have a few hair left on my head. But my predecessors tell me all the stories that they went through. There were many occasions where they really wanted to walk off. But fortunately, the resilience paid off. And in 1998, we had a very successful opening. And what started, and IT Park Bangalore actually set the standards for IT parks in Singapore. It was a very fortunate coincidence because the IT outsourcing wave made a quantum leap at that time, and IT Park Bangalore then set the standards for IT parks, and the rest is history. Bangalore developed into an IT hub. And following our relative success in Bangalore, we then moved to other locations, to Chennai, Hyderabad, subsequently to Pune, and then more recently also to Gurgaon. Now, interestingly, in many of these projects, we actually partnered the local government. Of course, partnering government is a double-edged sword, right? But our experience overall has been very positive. So, because we see ourselves more than just a real estate developer. We are long-term investors. We don't just go there, build something, sell, make the capital gains and move out. We are long-term investors. So we only go into a location where we feel our interests are aligned with the local government. And we are also in the business of actually creating good jobs, because that's how we started in Singapore. We started in Singapore by developing Science Park and as part of JTC in the early days. So we put a lot of emphasis in creating jobs. So we only go to locations where our interests are aligned with the government. So today we have got assets under management in India of about 2 billion Singapore dollars. I think things can always be better, but I must say in the last few years, things have been more positive than they have ever been before. As Gautam said, infrastructure is, and of course we are also in Singapore and China, where infrastructure gets built ahead of time. In India, infrastructure development always lacks the need. But we are seeing tremendous progress. Roads are being built at a speed which was inconceivable as recently as 5 years ago. I think they are building roads at least at a rate of 8 to 10 times more than in the past. Metros are being constructed and we can see the progress. So I think tremendous progress has been made. So we are positive about India. Whether more can be done, better things can be done, certainly, and we can talk about that later. But things are certainly improving. What do we see as our next phase of growth? As I said, we are in 5 locations now, mainly in IT parks. We hope to expand our portfolio within the next 5 to 7 years in that space. And in addition to that, we are looking at 2 new areas. One is logistics, because we feel there's tremendous potential for logistics in India, driven by the Make in India drive. And I personally do believe that for India to make progress, they have to push the manufacturing sector more strongly. Because any big country needs a significant manufacturing sector to create the jobs across the spectrum. And for manufacturing to succeed, the availability of good competitive logistics is critical. Of course, there's the whole area of e-commerce, which is growing, and a key enabler for e-commerce must be logistics. Of course, a game-changing event happened when the GST was introduced a couple of months back, because in the past, when you want to move goods from one state to another, the whole tax structure is different, so it did not enable companies to set up regional warehouses. So it was always very suboptimal. So we see with the introduction of GST, that's going to be a game changer. So we are moving into logistics. We have started developing our first greenfield logistics park in Chennai, and we are in the final stages of acquisition in Mumbai. The other area where we see huge potential and where we think more needs to be done in terms of regulation is related to digitalization. Just like you need physical warehouses to support the manufacturing and e-commerce sectors, you need data centers, which are essentially the warehouses for the digital economy, big data, cloud computing, so you need data centers. So that's an area which we think has tremendous potential, and also that's an area which is in need of the review of some of the policies that are currently in India in order to push for the growth of these sectors. So these are the 2 areas that we are looking at very closely. And finally, one very interesting thing that has happened is together with another Singapore company called Sembcorp, we have been chosen to develop the startup area of the new capital city for Andhra Pradesh, Amaravati. So that's going to be another very exciting and pioneering project that we'll be embarking on soon. So that, in a nutshell, is our experience in India so far. I think in the next round, then we can talk about what are the challenges. And obviously there are many challenges, but in a nutshell, I would say that we are very positive about India. It is one of our fastest growth markets, and we are keen to do more there. Thank you.
Manohar.
Thank you.
If you've been following the Indian markets, the financial markets, especially the stock market, is just going up and up. I mean, that's a global phenomenon, but in India, it's been quite dramatic. That's got something to do with, with some of the demonetization and other initiatives of the government, which has brought money into the financial economy, into the real economy. Instead of keeping money kept in other sources, people are bringing money into the economy. And I was just discussing before this panel with Hari about how we can tap some of this local money that's coming into financial markets by structures such as business trusts, real estate investment trusts, REITs, business trusts, because these are great ways of funding infrastructure and giving individuals a return, because people are looking, it's retired individuals, people are living longer. I mean, you just see what has happened to Singapore in the REIT market. I mean, if you go back 10, 15 years, there was no REITs in Singapore. And Singapore took a decision to develop REITs. I know Hong Kong started it, but Singapore came quickly behind and perhaps even surpassed Hong Kong in a REIT market. We have I see the president of the stock exchange here, $60-80 billion REIT market. And it is actually, if you listen to people who are looking for steady investments, it's a good way of giving people a new asset class to invest in. And this is, I think, a great opportunity in India. And Hari has something to share because there are a lot of things happening there, and there's expectation in this new budget. So Hari, a little bit about that.
Sorry, Hari, just before you start, I just forgot to mention one thing. We listed a REIT for our Indian properties in Singapore about 10 years ago. So that REIT is listed in Singapore for our mature Indian properties. And it has a market cap of about 1 billion. We went through several challenges, but especially because of the depreciation of the rupee. But since then, it has been one of the best performing REITs here in Singapore. And I think we fully agree that having REITs is a great enabler for the development of several infrastructure sectors. Sorry.
Thank you, Gautam. The company I represent, ILFS, stands for Infrastructure, Leasing and Financial Services. Leasing was a product that we could put in the Indian market, but about 15 years ago, the regulations changed and basically killed that market from our point of view. So we haven't done much leasing in that space. But we've looked at infrastructure both as a developer and as a financier. And over the last 25 years, we have moved from a focus on roads to almost every major infrastructure sector across the country. And I want to give you a kind of snapshot view in the few minutes that I have on what it takes to make it work. India, let me preface this by saying India is an extremely difficult country to work in. 47 official languages, 2,400 dialects, official dialects. It's a complex part of the world. And it's truly a democracy. So it's impossible in a democracy not to have different points of view. So anybody who wants to work in India needs to understand that that's the backdrop in which you're trying to make something happen in business. And the challenges that that imposes on you need to be internalized. So when we began in 1991, we're the only act in town in what's known as public-private partnership infrastructure projects. And we put up the first GSM telephony, we did the first power project, we did the first road project, we did the first water supply, first water treatment, wastewater treatment, industrial parks. Almost every single project that was done, we invented the concept in legal jargon in India called the SPV, the Special Purpose Vehicle, Project Request Financing. The Indian Toll Act began by saying that you cannot charge tolls. It ended up by saying, by exemption, you can charge tolls. We had that change, and we did a lot of work from 1987 when we incorporated to 1990 for 13 years. All we did was work with government on the policy framework and the enabling framework for financing projects. Between 87 and 1990, we managed to put in place, on a toll-based contractual framework, less than 100 kilometers of roads. From 2000 to 2017, the ILFS Transport Networks Limited manages owns, manages, and operates 27,000 kilometers of roads. And that's really the spirit of India, in a sense. Stay the course, understand the context, replicate what you have on your hand, which has been successful, and you can scale it up to dramatic levels. The single largest toll operator in the country is ILFS Transport. It is 4 times bigger than the next level. There are many challenges. Manohar mentioned about land acquisition. When you're doing 27,000 kilometers of roads, I can assure you that land becomes a major part of your competence. Again, it's very interesting. We have never ever had, in 27 years of working in India, in infrastructure, a problem where land acquisition has stopped our work. In 27,000 kilometers. Government has handed over land late to us and caused problems for our schedule, for sure. But when we've been asked to go and acquire the land, we haven't had a problem. We put up a power project in the south of India, 4,000 megawatt coal-based power project, for which we had to acquire 1,400 acres of land, contiguous land. We did this in 2.5 years. We didn't have a problem. So there is a way in which you can get things done, but you need to learn it, you've got to be very patient, and you've got to be very perseverant. And there is this context that drives almost anything we do in infrastructure across the country. This government that's come into place is very focused on infrastructure. As Manohar mentioned, the rate at which we complete roads now is at a historic high. And the government has been very clever about it. And again, this is what I'd call the Indian rope trick. So the roads that are being pushed through to achieve this pace are roads where the government already has the right of way. So they don't have too much acquisition to worry about. And this is actually a very good strategy. Push through what you have in your hand. Make it happen on the ground. The next phase would be to expand, where we would have to begin conversations with local communities about how that road can benefit them. And that inclusive dialogue has begun. Mr. Modi goes and talks about this in his election campaign at one end of it. The bureaucrats at the other end go and do the same thing, and so do the local politicians. So this energy that's being unleashed to make infrastructure happen is a real energy. How we as businesses can derive the benefit of this energy is the million-dollar question. And that requires to contextualize the India story in a very specific way around the very particular project that you're going to be actually embarking on. To enable India begin to address those issues, this government has made several changes. The one or two that I want to highlight to you, because it gives you a sense of how it's being looked at, is we all know the incredibly painful judicial processes that we have in India. It takes time, you never get an answer, and it keeps getting postponed and pushed out. So this government comes along, and including us, lots of the guys in this business have huge claims on government. And in most cases, these claims go into arbitration, and the average time till this government came into existence to settle an arbitration matter was 7.2 years. Post-2014, when we were asked to give suggestions to government as to what they should be doing, the one thing that we all came to was, you've got to get your act together on dispute resolution. So effective a couple of Novembers ago, this government passed an ordinance, which has then been converted into an act called the New Arbitration Act, which stipulates that the government shall, in arbitration, insist that it be done in 12 months, fixed. And if it can't be done in 12 months, you get 6 months additional an extension on certain basis to 18 months, and that's it. If the arbitration award goes against government, you as the claimant can go to government with a bank guarantee and take all your money out. The government department, if it feels has a chance of recouping this, can go to court and go through that process, but you are not being affected by the liquidity of your money being stuck in government. Now, the other big sticky point was arbitrators used to get fat checks for each sitting. So it was in their direct interest to elongate the arbitration proceedings. Now, it's a fixed monthly payment. Very reasonable, and there's no incentive at all for the guy to sit for 100 sessions or 2 sessions. If anything, because it's monthly fixed, He wants to be sitting on as many arbitration panels as possible and getting them through. In the last 12 months, we've had 6 of arbitration cases settled in government, which had not been done for the last 7 years. These are changes which happen on the ground and which matter and which actually makes business possible. The second broad theme that I want to put across is that we talk about livelihoods and employment as an opportunity. But it's a big task. To skill people to actually become employable is a big ask. The Indian education system is actually pretty defunct. Lots of work needs to be done to bring it to world standards. Yet we have very bright kids. So we began a skill development program in 2008. We're now in 2018, about a decade. We've already covered 2 million kids, all in employment. And we found that the biggest bottleneck for infrastructure was the medium and small industries of India, which are dependent on government infrastructure in order to be able to keep going and becoming globally competitive. So we began a cluster program. We work with over 5,000 small and medium entrepreneurs across the country. We have them in clusters, and we provide infrastructure for them on a paid-for basis. And it's quite amazing. We've made them green. We've given them access to logistics centers and support. We finance their working capital requirements. We help them source technology. And we have actually been able to support 5,000 entrepreneurs to become globally competitive and have those ambitions. How many of them will become globally competitive is a matter for them as entrepreneurs to realize for themselves. But from our point of view, these 5,000 become the face of infrastructure as we go forward. And it's commercially bankable, and it makes sense. Does this happen in all sectors? It does not. Are all governments responsive to the challenges of the 21st century? They're not. But is the track being set in a way in which we can take it to scale? I'd refer back to my road story. Up to 2000, 13 years after our incorporation, we had 100 kilometers. In 2018, we have a 27,000 kilometer portfolio. And I genuinely believe in the next 5 years, this country would have put in place the necessary platforms and the runways for a true takeoff. And hopefully then India will realize its potential. Thank you.
That's good. Very enlightening. You can never beat an expert from the ground, the ground experience. So, Hari, that's really good insights. So, Eng Seng, a little bit about GIC and how you see opportunities in India, as well as some of the things that you've already done there.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Gautam. Good afternoon to all. Thank you for having me here. I'll just start with a couple of introductory remarks on GIC and our infrastructure program. GIC is one of the 2 sovereign wealth funds from Singapore, as some of you will know. We manage a globally diversified portfolio across all the asset classes. We have been investing in infrastructure since, I would say, the mid-90s, first as part of our private equity program, and in more recent years, meaning about 11 years ago, we started investing in infra as a separate asset class. Today, it is also a global program run out of 4 offices with an AUM of about, coincidentally, about the same size as what Monahan was talking about. His business, about 20 billion on a global basis, and out of which about 20% are in the emerging markets. We invest primarily as a financial minority partner in deals through a variety of channels, through funds, through co-investments, and on a direct basis. We take a very long-term horizon in our investments. It could be 10, 20, 30 years or more. When we make an investment, there is no real clear divestment date predetermined at the point of entry. And we play that supportive financial partner role in our deals. Now, in India, we have been active there since also the, I would say, mid-2000s. And we continue to invest. We have been involved in projects in the port sector, in the telco tower sector, in the thermal power sector, and most recently in the renewables energy sector, where we have had much better success. Our initial investments were a little bit more patchy, but the market has changed quite a bit over the years. And as my two other colleagues here mentioned, the opportunities here are large, but there are some challenges that we encounter in the pursuit of these investments. Within Asia, India to us is the largest and most interesting market. But having said that, we haven't been able to also invest as much as we would like. If you look at the whole market here, it's a market which has adopted the use of private capital to help build up the infrastructure needs of the country as one of the earlier movers. In terms of scale, just to get a sense, just to close the infra needs gap of the country to support this industrialization and urbanization, is estimated to require about $1.5 trillion just over the next 10 years or so. The government is supportive. It's put in place a lot of framework to promote investment and to give investors greater comfort and to address bottlenecks in the system. So if you look at the regulatory framework that we see in India, in comparison to other countries that we have been investing in, it is actually pretty good. The regulations are well thought out. And generally, if you look at the stability of the regulation, they are also good. And, they've been stable. And you can say that in some of the developed European countries where, surprisingly, there have been more regulatory surprises. So why is it that investors like ourselves have still found it quite difficult and our sort of experience have been a bit more patchy? So beyond the regulation, there are a whole host of challenges at the operating level. Suffice to just say, it comes in different forms. Sometimes you have politics that are in the way, and you have bureaucracy that's in the way in terms of the approvals that you need and in the execution and implementation of these rules and regulations. And there are other small little challenges for us as well as an financial investor looking for deals in India. We can't do it quite on our own, and we need good local partners to help navigate all the different steps that you need to go through to get the projects done and executed well. And it's not been easy for us to find the right kind of local partner which shares the similar kind of investment philosophy and operates with the same degree, of the right degree of transparency and the governance standards that we would like to have. So if you look at then the market, it's one of the most competitive one at the same time. So competition is the other one challenge, and you have bids that are aggressive, not just from foreign investors, but especially from the local investors. In some of the earlier days, you see a lot of participation by, or more aggressive bids by some local entrepreneurs or the EPC players. Where the market is now evolving is that it's going through some changes, and it is evolving in a way that we are seeing more opportunities for us as a financial investor. Whereas in the start, at the beginning, most deals that we see were more in the greenfield space, and where the equity check sizes are relatively small and hence less suitable for us. We are also seeing some rationalization and consolidation in the market, where some of the players are recycling their assets or exiting the market and selling what they have invested in the past, and this provides a new area of potential opportunity for us. Having said that, again, the number of deals, secondary deals in the market that have actually closed is also still quite limited, because there's still quite a considerable valuation expectation gap between sellers and buyers. And at the same time, the impetus for some of the local players who need to divest isn't quite really there, because you have a in some ways, I would say, a banking system that is generally quite lenient in a way. And if you see some of the bids that are going in, some of the players that are supported by the banks, that would seem like the lending standards are based much more on, in some cases, relationship lending rather than just purely on the creditworthiness of the projects. So this has facilitated some of the more aggressive investments and bids by various players. Now, the market itself, in terms of the overall ecosystem and environment, despite all the challenges, some of the challenges that we have mentioned, is improving. The Modi government has been very proactive, as some have mentioned, in terms of taking additional steps to reform areas which are necessary to bridge gaps and to enhance the attractiveness of the overall environment. I'll just mention some others that may not have been mentioned. I mean, you have, in toll roads, I mean, land acquisition has been a tough area and challenge for many people. So you have the new Land Acquisition Act, and that has been put in place. That itself, of course, is a big step forward, but in itself also there are some other issues in that the authority themselves have not been able to acquire land at the pace that is desired or as fast as they hope they were able to do. Then you have in the electricity sector, the power sector, two of the main challenges in that sector there have been in the issue of security and adequacy of the fuel supply in the form of coal or gas. So you have plants that are built that are in some way ended up as more or less stranded assets because of inability to get the coal supply. Now, efforts have been put in to streamline and address these issues. There's a streamlining of the tendering process now. But these are projects which have locked in certain tariff level that, unfortunately, in some cases, it is not possible for these plants to secure mining rights at the right price to make it viable. And so you still have quite a bit of legacy issues that needs to be worked through over time and resolved. Now, then at the same time, you have, as if you look across the other part of the value chain in the power sector, you have the state electricity boards that, because of their challenges in some areas like collection of revenue, financial health hasn't been as great as they should be in the past. And there is that UDE reform effort to improve the financial health of all these state electricity boards. These are all steps and good measures in the right direction. They have improved the market and the operations of these SEBs. Still, over time, we just need a more permanent solution to that will improve fundamentally the foundations, the strength and health of the state electricity board. So, all in all, I would say we are very optimistic and positive on the direction. We see governments taking more efforts to make more projects available. With an example being the recent tender of some of the existing toll roads, government toll roads, and there's plan for a pipeline of this to be sold to the private sector. Together with all the reforms that we are seeing and continued effort, we're seeing a market that is not only large, but increasingly becoming more attractive for us as a financial investor to try to achieve our hope or aspiration of trying to do more there in that country. I'll conclude by just saying making one other remark that today we are at a very interesting point in that the cost of funding the construction of new infra projects is probably at the lowest level ever in history, given where interest rates and equity risk premiums are. India is very well positioned as a sort of early mover in the adoption of use of private capital, and through the reform measures, you're well placed to take advantage of current conditions here to roll out your infrastructure. And we, of course, hope to, like I said, be part of it and do more. Thank you.
That's a great point. I mean, I think this is the timing couldn't be better, in terms of availability of capital And also to your earlier point, Eng Seng, I mean, we've had years of private operators, promoters as they are called in India, often working with banks who have been very, very lax perhaps in the way they've extended financing. And many of these projects ran into trouble because they were not properly thought through in terms of viability, in terms of the projections. And as a result, we have one of the biggest problems in banking. I mean, you've got China on one side, India on the other. And whereas China is able to take steps very quickly and in a very strong way, I mean, one of the prices of being a democracy and having the states, because many of the banks have their origins in certain states. They're funding farmers, they're funding agricultural sector. So we, the banking sector is one of the big problems in India. But actually, if you see what has been happening, the whole sort of bankruptcy law, the asset reconstruction companies are now making it possible for other types of finance to come in to replace banks as providers of finance and capital. Just recently KKR, one of the big private equity firms, just announced asset reconstruction company. My own firm, Blackstone, has invested in an existing asset reconstruction company, partnering with HDFC and Tata. So capital, is not going to be a constraint for India. Capital is there, cost of capital is low. We need to just get some of the other things that have been coming up in the conversation. If we can get those right, I think India's aspirations to be a manufacturing sector, which requires, as Manohar has said, a good supply chain, good logistics, these are all very key. And in fact, I think for any government, and I think the Modi government is doing very well, very likely to win probably the 2019 election. But I think long term, for any government in India to be really credible and true to itself, it has to create jobs. Because it is large numbers. I mean, and that's where, even this government has fallen far short of the standards it set itself. You're talking about 1 million people joining the job market every month, with only 20 or 30,000 jobs being created. Many of the jobs are, not really quality jobs. There's underemployment. And as we have in this country, and I think I served on the board of EDB with Manohar, I think this government in Singapore always said, you have to have manufacturing. In the old days, almost 30% of our GDP was manufacturing, because manufacturing creates jobs. It creates jobs in this. You cannot have an economy which is just consumption and service-based. You have to have manufacturing, because it just means that there's so many more jobs that are created, and for that you need infrastructure. So that's why it is so critical. So anyway, we now move on to a port operator. Chief Ong has been on the ground, perhaps a little bit of your experience and how you see the things.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. PSA is it was the Port of Singapore Authority until 1997. And we corporatized in 1997, and since then, we are a commercial entity, and we are owned by Temasek. After 1997, actually, PSA first started in India in 1998. So very proud to say that this actually marks our 20th year of operations in India. We are now in Tuticorin, in Chennai, in Kolkata, Kakinada, and hot off the press, we have just finished the construction of phase 1 of what will be India's single largest container terminal in Nhava Sheva, Mumbai. Thank you. We've been working on this project for 3 years, and I must tell you that I met a lot of skeptics. And their first questions to me were always, I'm sure things are behind time, mountain of challenges, and so forth. No sugarcoating, I'm very proud to say as well. We have worked very closely with the government, the various ministries, the High Commission here, and we've been able to meet the construction milestones on time. In fact, we managed to meet it 1 day ahead of our contractual deadlines, which is, it speaks a lot to the very strong momentum that we are seeing in India, right? The support that is being given for infrastructural development. This terminal that we are developing, 3 years ago, it was just water. So we have gone through large-scale reclamation, over 100 hectares. It is not only a marine terminal, there is also a very big rail component. So not to be confused with the MRT here, right? But I always tell our team, as well as to our customers, that this is going to be a very big MRT, a marine and rail terminal. It's going to be a game changer because the rail capability, especially when the dedicated freight corridor is in operations, it will reduce the transit time of cargo from Mumbai into Delhi from what is today 3 to 4 days into just 24 hours. Wow. So we're very excited by this development. While this is a greenfield project, however, right, we've been able to leverage on our 20 years of experience in India. We have had the benefit of our local colleagues from Chennai, from Kolkata, from Tuticorin, to come into play, right, to assist with the development as well as in the training of our new team in Nhava Sheva. What are some of the challenges that we have faced? Well, I would say that certainly things like permitting, getting permits usually takes longer than one would expect. But we've been able to mitigate that. I think through the use of effective communication, starting that communication early, having many plan Bs, right? Plan B alone is not enough. And in some cases, actually biting the bullet and taking it upon ourselves, right, to push through some of the developments which should have been undertaken by other parties, but we see it as something necessary, right, to do it ourselves, right, in order, right, to get the project going. I think these have been ways, right, that we have been able to get the project delivered on time. Okay? In terms of an ecosystem, I think that's where the opportunity is, for the development of a freight and logistics ecosystem. We can build a terminal, but if you're facing congestion on the roads outside the terminals, if the dedicated freight corridor is not ready, that's where a terminal alone will not bring about that magic. It will not transform the freight and logistics industry. Right? So this is where, on a continued basis, we will need to work very closely with the different stakeholders, whether they be in the government or in the commercial realms, right, in order to bring freight and logistics to the next level in India.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
So now we move to Mark Rathbone, who is someone who helps with the structuring of infrastructure, to facilitate infrastructure investments. So Mark, some of your experience on the ground and how you see things.
All right, Gautam, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation today. I'll start off by saying that for those of you concerned about the cricket score, South Africa tend to lose matches very quickly on day 3, 4, and 5, so I think you'll be all right. No doubt our bowling attack will fall apart and you'll bowl us out very quickly. Anyway, so let's talk about the scale of Indian infrastructure as a starting point, because I think that's always a useful place to begin thinking about the challenges ahead. And in the short to medium term, India is looking to spend around about $483 billion on core infrastructure. So that's roads, railways, urban infrastructure, power and water, waste management. If you look at the global numbers, our own numbers estimate that by 2025, we'll be spending around about $9 trillion annually on infrastructure globally, and about $5 trillion of that will be in Asia. So approximately 60% will be Asian focused, and the majority of that will be India, China, and Japan outbound into ASEAN. The ADB number that was quoted earlier by someone on the panel, I can't remember which one, is a $26 trillion number in Asia is between now and 2025, and that is exclusively on power, transport networks, water and waste management. So that excludes low-cost housing, it excludes healthcare, it excludes things like education, it excludes partially some of the renewable energy requirements. And if you look at those numbers, they get slanted very heavily by China's involvement globally, where, for example, in renewable energy alone, they're looking to spend about $361 billion on just renewable energy between now and 2020. Okay, so the scale of the challenge in India is big, and it's made slightly harder by a few issues. So one is the complex nature of contracting. So different sectors, different states, you have different contract forms, different sectors aren't the same as others. So if you contrast that to some of the very mature PPP markets globally, what you do see is a commoditization of PPP contracts so that people understand it easier. And I would argue that for India to attract a lot of the global capital that's looking to invest in infrastructure as an asset class, we need to try and simplify contract forms so that people understand it more effectively. Different sectors have different maturity levels. So in the port sector in India, you have a very mature sector. Toll roads, very mature. Arguably in the toll road sector, India is probably more successful than any other territory. The Australian toll road market has fallen on its face through optimism bias, people funding projects with too aggressive a traffic forecasts. In South Africa, toll roads have fallen apart because of the political issues. So I just came back from South Africa last night. I was talking to my driver from More Private Travel, and he has 1,000 tickets from the toll roads where he just doesn't pay. So when they opened the toll roads in South Africa, people just drove through the gantries. They didn't bother paying. So the government has not managed that effectively, and clearly in India that has been done far more appropriately. I think the next big point to raise is around the ease of capital flow around the world, and the fact that big institutions, whether it be sovereign wealth funds or institutional capital from people like the Brookfields, IFMs, Future Funds, Canadian Teachers, the Nordics, the GIC, all of them, they will be looking to invest in territories where they feel that it's easy to invest in, they understand the regulatory framework, they get decent return for the risks that they're taking, and so they will focus on those markets. Brookfield, I think, is a bit of a leader, as is GIC in the Indian space. Recently, I think they've invested about $1.3 billion in real estate and looking to invest another $2 billion over the next couple of years. So clearly India is doing the right things in terms of attracting capital. If you then look at the asset class of infrastructure globally, what you are seeing amongst the institutions is that their focus on OECD markets is shifting. And they have to shift. It's crowded in those markets. There aren't enough projects. Returns are very low. So what they're looking to do is diversify geographically into the emerging markets. Probably not a huge allocation of their asset base, but certainly a portion of it. They're looking to diversify across the deal cycle, so going more into greenfield rather than just brownfield assets. And they're also looking to play at different parts of the infrastructure sector. So purchasing solar manufacturers, panel manufacturers, cement factories, that sort of thing, rather than purely investing in assets. Now, in my mind, India is very well placed as probably the primary PPP market in Asia, and certainly the most mature if you compare it to all of our regional markets, ASEAN or China. China's got a $1 trillion PPP program, but almost all of that is dominated by local SOEs. Certainly the big projects, the small ones aren't worth looking at. Whereas India's program is very broad, it's across different sectors, it's across the whole country. The government is dealing with institutional strength and passing regulations that make it easier for people to understand the market and invest. So dealing with some of the more basic issues around risk and return, I think will be something that India needs to think about. It's a highly competitive market, so if you look at the recent solar bids, I think the last ones were 3.4 cents per kilowatt hour, lower. So, I mean, that's ridiculous. If you compare that to anywhere else in the market, the global solar market, it's by far the cheapest. It's a highly competitive market, and people will start looking at that and going, well, is it worth us making the effort to invest in this program when you've got so much competition and I can go and invest and get 12% rather than 3% or 4% on my investment. I think I'll probably finish off with two broad areas. One is around the future role that India can play in the Asian market. If you consider China and Japan and what they are doing in our region currently. So Japan have, over a long period, provided concessionary financing to governments to build out infrastructure. So if you look at the North-South line in Jakarta, it's billions of dollars over 42 years at a 0.1% interest rate. Commercially, that's unachievable in any banking market. But that is effectively taking Japan outbound. China, you've got the Belt and Road Initiative, which is clearly having a catalytic impact on the infrastructure that's being built around our region and the subcontinent. And that, combined with things like ASEAN connectivity, are big programs that are forcing the agenda around infrastructure development. And I think India has the ability to play in that field. Whether or not they want to or not is another question. The final point I'll probably make is around some of the big trends, and India is well placed to deal with some of these. Technology, you've got some of the greatest talent in the world in India, whether it be autonomous vehicles, augmented reality, drones, 3D printing, all of those are having an effect on our infrastructure space. Urbanization, you've got higher urbanization rates in India, you're building new capital cities in Andhra Pradesh, you've got the 100 smart cities in Modi's plan. That is no different to the rest of the world who are trying to do it better. But India, through the experience you've got, the capabilities you've got, the talent you've got, should be able to really drive a lot more into the market, I would say. The final point is probably around demographics, and Gautam touched on it earlier, where you've got 1 million people going into the job market every month and 30,000 jobs being created. Now, clearly, that is a problem. That is not a sustainable demographic equation, and that will lead to social issues over the longer term. What you're seeing in China is that they are diversifying their economy away from low-cost manufacturing into higher-cost manufacturing, investing heavily in R&D, and they're exporting a lot of their excess capacity along things like the Belt and Road Initiative. I'll stop there, Gautam. I could carry on.
Mark, some really interesting points. I like the point about India taking a bigger role in the region. I think India clearly wants to do it. India, under the Modi government, sees itself as a leader. And I think we're best to start, but within some of the ASEAN countries. I mean, this is, after all, an India-ASEAN event. I think countries like Myanmar and others, Vietnam, with India have good relations. But I think that would also be a way of creating good jobs, because, you know, as you have large companies, I mean, that's China has really it's a very good strategic move on China's part. It sort of not only helps you on the geopolitics scene, but also gets your own companies becoming larger, you know, and I think India really should focus on that area. I think probably it is already, but I think it's a very good point that you brought up. So again, now I think we have a few more minutes for this session to go, and I think I would just like to open it up to the audience for questions, please. If you can just say who you are and your organization, that would be helpful.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Daulat Singh. My parents were from Punjab and they passed away in Singapore. Just to pour my grievances, what difficulties I faced when going back to India. On your end, you people are inviting us to invest in India on retirement basis. I'm 70 years old now. Now, the first thing is, sir, you were in Whitefields a couple years back. I went to Whitefields when they were slums 30 years ago. And eventually I decided to take up a small investment in property in Koramangala. Now, for that past 20, 30 years, I have been moving up and down just to pay my income tax, 7,000 rupees, that's 200 Sing dollars, buy a plane ticket to pay my property tax. The problem is, when I pay my property tax now, I have to go online. And when my results come out, how much I have to pay, I have to have a local Visa card, which no bank is going to give me because I don't have an Aadhaar card. Aadhaar card is meant for Indian citizens. Now I got to have a PAN card. PAN card is also not available so easily. So I have a difficulty in paying my property tax, one. So these are the problems we face. And if I want to get a handphone connection, they ask for Aadhaar card and PAN card again. That is another problem. The other major problem is, now that I'm 70, I already planned 40, 50 years ago that I want to stay put in India in my last days of my life. So I planned 30 years ago, Koramangala, and I was deciding only a couple of 2-3 years back that from Singapore, I'll carry $250,000 after selling my house and invest as what you are inviting us to do so, buy shares. Now, the FRDI problem has come up, where the bank goes bankrupt and you will only be paid 1 lakh. That is about 2,000 Singapore dollars. So, Pio, sir, I'm going to disturb you again because you are DBS and your banks are in India. Please help us out.
Thank you, Donald Singh.
Thank you very much. So I think
Gautam, I'll leave it to you to
yeah. So
finesse
I
this.
think those are issues at a micro level. I think this is a session where we try to do things at a larger macro level, but they are real issues. But I think banking with DBS may solve a lot of your problems. So I think, yeah.
I'll ask more of a macro question. I work for a solar company, company called First Solar. We are a US-based manufacturer. We also do develop in India. I mean, for me, the problem, and I intimately understand the solar bids, the recent ones. I sometimes feel, and I don't know if all of you feel that, there's too much capital chasing too few good projects, right? The risk-adjusted returns in India are sometimes questionable. Not always, but if you're in the greenfield space, that ILFS has been, we are a long-term player. If you have a 20-year horizon, and that's great. But the time you're doing your bid, it's a TIG, trust in God, number you put in, right? You say, we'll get there somehow, but that the returns right now with global risk premiums being so low and returns in India being pretty terrible right now, it's difficult to convince myself that the returns will keep going down, right? You hope that there's another bond market upside or whatever you have upsides that you as investors, actually macro investors, do you feel that? I mean, it's a how do we finance unless the contractual framework improves dramatically, that the perception of Indian risk appetite or India gets a couple of more rating upgrades because of better macro conditions, it does feel like the returns are not adequate when adjusted for risk.
Yeah.
Just thoughts.
Okay. Hari, do you want to take the question?
Sure. So we faced the situation in 2009 to 2012 in the road sector. Every EPC guy not getting an EPC contract bid atrociously for a road concession, and we just stopped bidding. We don't bid for road concessions. By 2014, everybody was bankrupt. We woke up and began bidding for jobs at reasonable prices, which we felt was commensurate to the risk you're taking and the return you need to give your shareholders. Similar, in my view, is happening in the solar sector. I think it's just crazy. But the tragedy for all of us is it's not limited to an Indian promoter, entrepreneur trying to make a business in this space. It's very large international players also bidding at these ridiculous prices. And we have stopped bidding in the solar space. We have found another way of investing in solar. We have found another way of investing in wind. In fact, we're talking to First Solar about how we can take it to scale. And we think it's a reasonable way of doing it. And it's a much more calibrated, it understands the context. But the bottom line is you've got developers both internationally and domestically willing to take insane risks and a very skewed trade-off on return on risks on the one hand, but they're real investors. I mean, if you want to lose your money, I can't stop you from doing that. So And they're good investors. So from a government point of view, I don't see why the government of India should not play to its strength. It does want to put up 200,000 megawatts of renewable energy. It's offering it in packages. It's got a very good policy in place. It's us as investors and developers who need to exercise our judgment. And we're not doing that. And to that extent, the government benefits, hopefully the people benefit, if these projects do come into existence. So my point is, from our limited point of view, we will not bid in a race to the bottom. It doesn't make sense to us. And there are real good opportunities in India in the renewable space that won't have to bid for the bottom. We just to clarify, we put up a gas-based power project with ONGC in the northeast of India. And in order to be able to take this power from that location in Tripura into mainland India, we had to build a 650-kilometer transmission corridor, which we did as part of a gas-based power project. 650-kilometer transmission corridor. But our project was integrated with that transmission mechanism. Despite every other gas-based power project in the country having a problem, the only one that's operating successfully is this one project in a remote corner of India, linked because of its 650-kilometer transmission corridor. It took us 4 years to build that corridor. We had to cross the Brahmaputra, which is a very big challenge. We did that. For us, that was the project. So when we look at a project, we don't look at it in terms of a panel. It's the whole integrated project.
So if it's any consolation, the challenge that you are facing, all investors are facing. There's lots of liquidity chasing projects, and India is seen as a very attractive girl in town right now. So shared misery is half misery.
I fully agree with that. Next one question.
My name is Pawan Sishte. As an introduction, I spent a couple of decades in equities market, and I'm now focused on water in policy space. My question is to Hari. Actually, I look exclusively at urban water in Asian context, and that keeps me worried about India. When I looked at in 2030, 2.5% of India's urban land will have 40% of India's population. I think there's probably more need to be done on urban water space, and I would like to know your thoughts because you're the key player in India. Thank you.
So we did India's first commercial water supply project in a town called Tirupur, which is a textile town. And it was commercially structured on a project recourse basis, and it was successfully implemented. It has still the lowest transmission loss rates in the country from a distribution and transmission point of view. Successful technically. I think if I want to summarize the problem we are facing in water, it's a very simple problem. People are willing to pay for water, but governments are unwilling to charge for water. And that is the real problem. Somehow we need to get past the political and bureaucratic hesitancy to bite the bullet and actually price water. I've been arguing for a long time in government circles that we should not leave water as a water problem. It's actually a health problem, it's an environmental problem, it has all other kinds of problems. So we really need to club all of this. So when a guy gets poor drinking water and falls sick, can't work, and has to buy medicines and be hospitalized, all of these are costs. So when you say to somebody you're paying 4 rupees per 1,000 liters, that's not true. He's actually paying 500 rupees a 1,000 liters because he has to include the costs of not working for 5 days. He has to include the mobility costs of moving to a doctor and coming back, the cost of medicine and treatment. When you do all of that, that's the real cost of poor quality water in a city. But that somehow hasn't really gone down well with the politicians and the bureaucrats. And unless we get our head around that problem very bluntly, we won't solve this problem. It's an underpriced asset which will be overexploited by a mushrooming population.
Any other questions? One last question.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My question. I'm
A bit
Chong,
louder, please. Louder.
I'm Chong, a retired chartered accountant, formerly with PwC. My question addressed to Mark. This conference, the theme is Ancient Route, New Journey. To me, it's like a mirror of Belt and Road Initiative. So when I look at the map outside the exhibition, it actually overlap with the Belt and Road across 7 65 country and region from Beijing to Spain. So from a price waterhouse point of view or from macro point of view, how these two big initiatives started by China and India respectively can compete and cooperation at the same time instead of doing confrontation. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try and stick to the non-political aspects of it because I'm definitely not known as being a politician. So Belt and Road is a very big focus of ours in the firm. I'm one of the leaders that are looking at that. And certainly there's a lot of talk around the reasons why China put forward Belt and Road in 2013 at the APEC summit in Bali. But there were multiple objectives around Belt and Road: internationalization of the renminbi, diversifying their economy outside of low manufacturing base, throwing a lot of growth into the hinterland of China, exporting a lot of the excess capacity that they have, and probably very importantly, and this is an area where I think China and India probably are at loggerheads, is China showing the world that a lot of their standards of building and construction and technology are as good as anywhere else. Whether you think that or not is another question, but that is one of their objectives. If you look at the way that China are approaching Belt and Road, there are a number of different types of opportunity. Firstly, it's across 6 corridors, so 4 land routes, 2 maritime routes that connect North Australia all the way through Indonesia, Southeast Asia, subcontinent, Eastern Europe and Western Europe into the UK. You mentioned 65 countries, that's correct, about 4.4 billion people, and the total spend is going to be somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion, depending on what gets built out. So when we're talking to our clients about Belt and Road, the one thing that we do mention is that the economic corridors along which the Belt and Road is being built are quite varied. So if you look at the Pakistan-China corridor, you've got about $50 billion worth of investment that's going in there now, and that's 34 billion in energy and about 12 billion in transport networks. Now, that corridor is then leading to catalytic projects around that, whether it be water projects, housing, healthcare, education, all sorts of different things. So what we're doing in our team globally is looking at Belt and Road and trying to figure out how we can take our clients from different sectors and different countries to the partners that they might need to partner within China to get a part of the action. And it doesn't matter if you're talking to banks, financial services, infrastructure funds, investors, constructors, providers of construction equipment, everyone wants a piece of it. That's very high on the agenda of most organizations. Now, I don't believe India has signed up to the Belt and Road MOU, which is understandable, but neither is Australia, neither is the US. Belt and Road has attracted probably some of the most investment from 2 US companies, one being General Electric, who generated $2.3 billion of revenues simply by providing turbines to Chinese SOEs last year, and they're looking to double that revenue number over the next 2 years. So whether you signed up to the MOU or not doesn't necessarily preclude your industry base from participating in the opportunities that Belt and Road offer. Financing-wise, at this stage, majority of the financing has gone through the Chinese policy banks or commercial banks. AIIB is not a Belt and Road bank. AIIB is a multilateral development bank in the same form as ADB, World Bank, Deferred African Development Bank, all of them. So I would say there isn't a need to have the confrontation between India and China. I would always be saying the way you want to try and do it is through cooperation and trying to figure out a way forward rather than try and fight. Trying to fight China is going to be a challenge. They are big, they've got a lot of capital, a lot of people, they've got appetite to invest. They invest, what, 800 billion to $1 trillion in R&D alone every year. Every year. So okay. I hope that touches on an answer for your question.
Thank you, Mark. I think we've come to the end of the time for this panel discussion. I think it's been a really good interactive session. We've heard a range of different professionals with different areas of expertise. I think if I can summarize it, there's a lot of optimism, a lot of opportunities in the whole infrastructure section, but it's not without its challenges, not without its difficulties. And as we've seen, there's a lot of money. I mean, India is one of the key markets for every financier to look at. And with money being cheap, I think this is the problem. When money is cheap, there's often a lot of money being thrown at projects. The competitiveness increases. And if you are a shrewd investor who wants to be successful, you will have to do your sums and make sure that you invest and back the right project. But I think India will be a key market for years to come in this whole infrastructure space. And I think all of us who are in this space and are either investors or owners, developers, consultants really cannot afford to ignore this market. So on that basis, I'd like to thank my panelists and for all of you to, for giving up your Saturday afternoon to listen to us. Thank you very much.